Welcome to the second East Midlands Salon powered by Zoom. I'm Dennis Hayes, one of the founders of the East Midlands Salon. And today I'm very pleased to have Vanessa Pupavac and Mladen Pupuavac speaking on our topic of what is a citizen. Now, I know that some of you out there probably think that there's no concept of a citizen available to modern times unless you can turn out in the agora with your spear in some sort of vision of Periclean Athens that people still venerate. But Vanessa and Mladen are the authors of a forthcoming book called Changing European Visions of Disaster and Development. And we've been trying to get Vanessa and Mladen to talk about citizenship, because after each East Midlands Salon, we've had discussions that just go on until very late, and we've had some fascinating discussions about citizenship. So the format for tonight will be Vanessa and Mladen will talk for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll come over to everyone else for contributions and debate in the usual fashion, back and forth between Mladen and Vanessa and everybody here. And then at about 8:30, I'm going to unmute everybody, but stop recording, and we can have an informal discussion. Because we normally do that in the pub, in the Brunswick Inn, for an hour or longer. And that's where some of the most interesting discussions happen. So that'll be the informal bit. So if you've got any alcohol, you can join us for an informal drink at 8:30, and I expect most of you have. So Vanessa, over to you. I shall
So, yeah, we unmute, yeah.
You're on mute.
Yeah. So the theme of tonight is what is a citizen? But when we're looking at what is a citizen, I think we need to look at what is a citizen at a particular moment and the questions that raises. And I think for many of us, the experience of the lockdown has made us think about what sort of era we're in. And there has been a discussion that we're at the end of one era, and that the pandemic is going to mark a new era, and that there is a sense in terms of the lockdown that in terms of being a citizen, what does it mean to be a citizen when we're locked up? In key respects, that represents in Greek terms being idiots, because we're confined to the private sphere. So thinking about eras, during the lockdown, we've spent quite a lot of time going back to those big books like Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man, which those books that was seminal books 30 years ago and marked the end of the Cold War. So Fukuyama's book, End of History and The Last Man, derived first from an article in 1989 and then written up as a book in 1992. And if you're on, if you teach international relations, then it's a key book that we all sort of said, end of Cold War, end of history, a key book. So this book, so what was Fukuyama's key argument? Key argument that was that at the end of the Cold War, there were no viable alternatives to liberal democracy, that the end of history was the culmination of his historical ideas since the 16th century. And what you had achieved in 1989 with the demise of the Soviet Union was a remarkable, and I'm quoting here, a remarkable consensus concerning the legitimacy of liberal democracy. The ideal could not be improved upon. So you have this idea. Fast forward 3 decades, and contrary to Fukuyama's hopes, we have Ivan Krastev and you can see that Stefan Holmes' The Light That Failed, that discusses those East European states that inspired Fukuyama's book, explicitly turning away from ideas of liberal democracy and championing the idea of illiberal democracy. And meanwhile, since 1989, there's actually been a change of meaning of liberal democracy and citizens since Fukuyama wrote the book. And there's nothing like a lockdown for going back and rereading all those books. And if you go back to Fukuyama's book, he talks about the meaning of being a member of a liberal democracy. And he talks about, so thinking about citizenship, and I quote, "We are democrats, that is, proponents of the principle of popular sovereignty and the guarantee of basic rights under a rule of law." And I think for those of us who lived through Brexit for 4 years, that idea of popular sovereignty has really been challenged in the last four years. So it's really quite striking to see it proudly proclaimed in this sort of seminal book of 1992, something that got seriously challenged, has been seriously challenged in the last 4 years. So what we've had, so thinking about that and why the idea of popular sovereignty feels alien in respects to notions today, what's quite striking about our thinking about citizenship today is how it's shifted away from the nation state and moved towards the global sphere. So that, and Alex will know more about this in terms of the curriculum. What we have is a move away from the idea of a national citizen and democratic place-based, nation-based rights towards the ideal of the global citizen, an ideal of an international system of independent nation states, ideals of autonomy, of self-legislating, self-governing communities, to the idea of global human rights, from independence to interdependence, from national government to based on a sort of central executive and national parliaments, drawing on democratic policies, towards ideas of global governance, so government to governance, and sort of multi-layered ideas of governance, and away from parliamentary politics, more towards human rights advocacy, NGO activism, new social movements, interests, lobby groups, and so on. So in summary, we've moved away from nation-state, place-based rights towards the idea of global, portable human rights. And these developments are often perceived as enhancing citizenship, but what we suggest is that actually they've actually hollowed out citizenship. They've hollowed out meaningful rights, rights of self-determination and democratic accountability, and ultimately have undermined our place in the world, our home in the world. And that in what we've created, if you like, through this shift of sort of what global citizenship represents, is a global house of cards, or if you want somebody else talking about it, Sloterdijk, we've created a sort of a crystal palace, a vulnerable crystal palace, a house citizenship based on sand, and that at the same time that we have shifted away from grounded place-based rights and shifted towards global governance and human rights, global human rights. We've also seen a shift in how we're governed, away from accountable government towards unaccountable governance at a distance by sort of absentee landlords. And that, in summary, governance today is becoming more arbitrary. Our rights are becoming weaker, and that in key respects, the erosion of a place-based politics, a place-based set of rights has become, politics has become more unhinged, and accompanying that we see more polarization in societies, and also a more unhinged, what Hannah Arendt calls a sort of sandstorm politics, that in the desert condition we have where our politics, democratic politics, our place-based politics withered away. We have a politics that's marked by sandstorms, that issues that suddenly arise and then suddenly disappear again without consolidating community, without consolidating our rights. That's me, and then it'll be done.
Okay. Okay. So I think we're really talking about citizenship in a globalizing world, and I'll structure my discussion so mainly in terms of human rights, and I'll just briefly talk about globalist paradigm. So I think the key question I wanted to ask myself, and I'm inviting you to think about, is this relation between the rise of cosmopolitanism and its impact and consequences for traditional national citizenship. And I think this rise of global citizenship, which is evident, I think, particularly among the young people today, can be attributed to two factors. One is the rise of the globalist paradigm, which used to be a thing of the ivory towers, something that sort of devoted activist academics embrace. But I think today we are talking about the mainstream. I think globalism today is the mainstream. And obviously I haven't got much time to go into this, but I'll just mention ideas like complex interdependence, the idea that no state, however powerful it is able to retain its sovereignty completely. That we're talking here about vulnerabilities and resilience, and probably the time we are going through, the time of this virus, it probably makes this argument very appealing. On the other hand, there's been this rise of human rights, and human rights is the rise of human rights, and its universalization has been, in my view, very much linked with the globalist paradigm. In a way that it provides a normative framework legitimizing globalization. globalization has been seen as a sort of natural phenomenon, a phenomenon that is inevitable, irreversible, and something to be adapted. Not certainly, it's not advisable to resist it or question it. And I think there's an interesting link here with the notion of human rights, which is also this idea that human rights are natural rights. They're not something that arises from interaction with other people. It's just something that's granted on somebody through the fact of being human. And I think significantly what this whole discourse of human rights does is that separates rights from politics, from the political process, particularly from democratic participation. And this is something that, in my view, raises some very significant questions about human rights and how it affects democracy today. Now, I would like to move on to say a few words about human rights, although I haven't got, again, I haven't got too much time, but I'll just say, because when you mention human rights, different people mean different things. I would say that, in my view, I would restrict my definition of human rights to right to life, but in practice, human rights include right to free speech, right to political association, right to shelter, right to family life, you name it. And there are so many different human rights. Now the question is, are all these rights sometimes in conflict with each other, and what happens if they do? Now, the advocates of human rights argue that there is no hierarchy between these rights, that they're all equally important, they are non-negotiable, they are inalienable, and really, if you want to make a claim on society, the easiest and the simplest way to call it human right. So the moral absolutism with which these claims are framed is something that doesn't really allow for politics. So if somebody denies your human right, you can't really engage with them because they're human right deniers. Elevation of human rights above democratic politics leads to activist politics. This is something that Vanessa briefly mentioned when she talked about social movements and similar terms describing essentially the same thing. I simply call it activist politics. And when I say activist politics, I don't just mean some people doing politics part-time. I'm talking about people who are part of state institutions or professional institutions, who are human rights activists, who use their bureaucracy to promote human rights agenda. And there are examples I can mention maybe in discussion later on. So when we try to picture all this, what's happening with this shift from normal sort of traditional democratic politics to activist politics, we can see this picture of this loose networked structure which is good for participation. It broadens participation, but problem with this model of network, this network structures, is that it blurs the responsibility and accountability. And also as a consequence of these problems with accountability and responsibility, people are staying away from politics, and that is a problem I think we're experiencing, particularly as I mentioned earlier with young people who move into this sort of activist politics. So I will just end with saying, again, posing the question from the beginning, national and cosmopolitan citizenship, what is the relationship between them? Are they mutually incompatible, or do they substitute? Do they supplement each other? Does cosmopolitan citizenship extend our freedom to make us global citizens, and therefore having a greater say in the world affairs? So I'll pass over to Dennis.
Thanks, Mladen. There have been some vitriolic debates on Facebook and Twitter about the relationship of the nation state and some other more nebulous view of what citizenship could be. So it's quite an intense discussion at the moment. So if you want to speak and make any comments, you know what to do. Put your hands up and I'll take you. And Kerry, I'll unmute
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. You two, that was very clear and very good. I have a few questions. I'll try and be very quick. Firstly, what I'm not clear about are the real drivers that produce that shift from the national to the global in terms of what I see at the global level is the denial of citizenship. So on your last question, I think that they are incompatible, cosmopolitanism versus the national in terms of citizenship. The former denies us the latter. My example would be in relation to COVID, talking to people around the world and in particular in Ghana, where the universal application of supposedly what is better for us all, when there was only 9 cases in Ghana, meant people starved. And the troops were on the streets, there were barricades preventing people getting back to the villages, markets were closed and so forth. And, you know, very anti-human consequences to a seeming, universal human set of policies, which very much what globalism represents, in my view, regardless of place. And my final question, maybe for later in the discussion, is on the Shamima question. As everybody said, that it was absolutely terrible that this girl, regardless of what she'd done with ISIS, be denied her citizenship. And so I wonder your take on that. And for me, I felt that her citizenship, which I value all the time, our citizenship, and its denial through these bureaucratic processes, her citizenship was not the problem. The real problem, and I was faced with this with lots of young people, was the level of sympathy for Shamima, regardless of ISIS's atrocities. And they're more concerned about her than what ISIS has done. And to me, the prior problem wasn't what everybody then said, oh, we must protect her citizenship, but was to challenge the anti-human ideas that have gripped young people. And I think globalism, unfortunately, plays a real part in that, yet it seems to have taken on a form of citizenship, which is a faux citizenship, if you like. And I wonder what you thought about that. Or was that a sandstorm, as you, Vanessa, refers to it?
Definitely a sandstorm. Alex, I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so thank you for the introductions. Just picking up on Kerry's point, in terms of drivers, I mean, I wanted to talk about the United Nations and their curriculum for climate change, which is something that's taken off over the last year or so, well, a couple of years. I mean, it's interesting that a lot of these ideas, and we're seeing that perhaps this week with the protests, do seem to sometimes come out of academia and then into the wider world. But I remember I was in the US in the 2000s, and loads of people writing about citizenship, but nobody writing about national citizenship. Everyone wanted to write about gender citizenship and environmental citizenship and cosmopolitan citizenship. So you can see that it's every which way of looking at it, but through the nation state. So that's where we are. But I guess I think what's interesting for me is sort of erosion at the top from the global institutions like the United Nations, but also erosion at the bottom. So in relation to the climate change curriculum, there's been an alliance, and I guess there's always been an alliance to some extent between globalists and the green movement. But it's striking how last year, because obviously we had these student protests, a lot of people just jumped on this UN, it's called UN CC Learn. So it's a climate change course that you can sign up to through the United Nations, and it's been promoted through a publisher in the UK. Anyway, 85,000 people have taken their course. They've signed up to become UN climate change teachers. But yeah, I guess it just struck me, you would think people would have a bit more hesitation about joining something like the United Nations as a progressive organization. But let me just read you some of the courses some of the units you can take on their courses. So on this course, Introduction to the Green Economy, open online course on gender and the environment, Introduction to Sustainable Finance, sustainable consumption and production in Africa, climate change, international legal regime, children and climate change, sustainability, blah blah blah. I actually took the course myself, and because I wanted to write about it, so I thought I'd better find out about it. And you're sort of going through these things. You think, why are they doing all this? Why are they going through this? Because obviously they're trying to promote the place of women in in developing countries. They're trying to promote positive attitudes around sexuality. So at one level it sounds progressive, doesn't it? And you sort of, I was thinking, well, what do they get out of it? What do they accomplish from promoting all these things? And I guess the thing I came up with was legitimacy. Gives them legitimacy as an organization to have influence in these countries, because it is all focused on developing world. Strangely, it's not about our countries that need to change, but it's the developing world. So just finally, in this alliance between the UN and a lot of which are geography teachers, these people who want to sign up to their course, they in terms of citizenship, effectively what they're promoting is a model which people are kind of disciplined, I think, by climate change and the environment, that because of the climate and it's, Gaia comes in, that the earth has agency and is telling us what to do, and we need to listen to the earth. Effectively, it diminishes the scope for us to have agency. We must reduce our footprint. We must do what Gaia tells us. So, together they create a narrative which is a very diminished form of citizenship.
Thanks, Alex. Simon, I'll unmute you.
Thanks. So similar question. around human rights. So particularly Mladen, how damaging do you think the human rights narrative process, institutions of have been? Because for me, I find the whole kind of mention of them really, really frustrating and really annoying, where people trivialize rights to their human right to go shopping and their human right to do absolutely everything. But at no stage is there a democratic mechanism to establish those rights. Whereas civil rights in a nation state, you have the democratic process. It might not be brilliant, it might not be perfect, but at least there is a mechanism to codify and express what we as a society want to organize around. Whereas human rights seems to be and I don't know how conscious it is, but it does seem to be this external body, an external force that then override the kind of civil decision-making process and legislate on behalf of people, and most importantly then allow themselves the authority to intervene against civilians and their civil rights. So there is a real tension there, and it does match the kind of globalization agenda, and particularly it coming out of the Second World War and the aftermath of the Second World War. It's never a good starting point to promote rights. So it's kind of am I just being mad at hating human rights? And secondly, how conscious is the
Oops, my fault, Simon. Sorry.
It's all right, I finished.
Okay. I'm going to go back to Vanessa and Mladen to comment on those two before I take Richard, Mo, and everyone else. So over to you.
Yeah, I'll answer in order which questions were asked. First, Kerry, about drivers of well, globalization creates power imbalances, and some sections of societies are become more powerful than others, and I think that's what happens. And also, this is not just the case in places like Africa, where you have local NGO staff who are incorporated large global structures. But it's also the case, I think, also in the West. I would say that the boomerang effect that Hannah Arendt talks about is very much evident here. About I'll have to be brief. I'm sorry. I would like to talk longer, but I have to. Alex's question, I really enjoyed your. Thank you for telling me about this climate change curriculum, and I think there are many similarities what's happening in this sphere of global politics with what happens in the rights area. And I very much agree with your kind of conclusion about denial of agency. Globalization, functional theories of globalization are essentially structuralist theories that go so far that they deny agency. Globalization is, as I've already said, is something completely outside of our power and something better not resist than something we have to adapt. So terms like complex adaptive systems have been borrowed from systems thinking to describe how to respond to globalization. And in relation to Simon's question about the effect of how damaging human rights narrative. Where do I start? Again, I have to be brief. I think what the damage that human rights narrative has done everywhere is that it undermines or abolishes, has a gross effect on the factual nature of life. So the principles, like the principle of reciprocity, mutuality, simply disappears. So people are encouraged to make their case, whether it be minority rights or national rights. They're encouraged to make their case in terms of human rights. Instead of trying to reach out to their neighbors, try to make some sort of accommodation agreement. They're always asking for some external patronage, and this is really corrosive, and we see evidence all around the world. So international law has been transformed into transnational law. So treaties, there are no longer treaties. We have compacts, like compact for migration, recently 2 years ago, if I remember correctly, in Marrakesh, basically describing illegal migration as a human right. So if you want to cross borders, don't want to reveal your identity, local authorities, they can't bond, they can't restrict your movement. They have to provide you with accommodation and assistance and so on. So I'll stop there, but maybe we can go back to
Vanessa.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that question raised about, well, where does this driver come from, that shift from nation-based citizenship towards human rights and global citizenship? Because it's one thing for weak countries, you know, whether it's Bosnia, for example, you know, where you've got countries that are really weak, and you've got elites that seek to find to bolster their support through external protection. So one can see that historically, those patterns where weak countries would seek external support. I think the thing that's really I think we have to look at a particular country when we're talking about the US, Britain, Germany, or France, to understand why states that were strong states, why they turned towards transnational governance or global governance. I think if one wants to understand the US, and I think the US is quite important here. Christopher Lashley's The Revolt of the Elite, I think, is really important. But also, again, in terms of, I was quite surprised at Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, not this book, but a more recent book, his book, Political Order and Political Decay. And when you look at, so what one sees in the US is that where you've got a very weak Congress, the way you don't have a strong parliament in the way that in Europe we've had stronger parliaments, particularly in Britain, where you've got a strong executive, the crown in parliament, where you've got where we want to change things. If parliament wants to change things and the government wants to change things, relatively historically, it's relatively straightforward for the executive to change things. But in the US, you've got a whole system of checks and balances that has created a problem of gridlock. And what one sees in Fukuyama describes a pattern of where it's difficult to change things through your representatives in Congress. What you have is a pattern of people turning to law and legal advocacy and special lobbying and the courts to resolve problems. And I think that's where and then where you have this way of seeing law as a solution to problems, you actually start thinking, well, if law is the solution, if we could codify that internationally, that's even better, because then our courts, we can get through the problem of gridlock, of stasis. So in key respects, you have this idea becoming really significant, this model of legal advocacy as a substitute for democratic politics, coming from the US and becoming highly significant in the EU. And the key way that is, it's highly important in understanding Germany and Germany's difficulties of being a power in Europe, and the way that it's tried to mediate that is the turn to law and a turn to a interdependent, a transnational law, so that again, another fantastic book is this one, German Europe by Ulrich Beck, that's really, really good on how Germany, because of the history of the 20th century, is deeply uncomfortable with sovereignty and with power and the assertion of its own sovereignty, and has sought to mediate power by not being an independent sovereign state, by the form of by a sort of form of sort of responsibility to protect, and a sort of interdependent legal framework that limits, that constrains, that frames German exercise of power within transnational institutions.
That's a really good point about Germany. Very interesting. Okay, Richard. Richard? Oh, he's gone. Okay, Joe. Joe?
Yeah.
Oh, Richard, you're there. Hi.
Yeah. Yes, sorry, Joe. Vanessa, the last point you made was so interesting. I really feel I ought to say something about that, but I wanted to say something about the generality of the issues before us, really, which you have addressed this evening. The tension between the self-asserting individual, the community that they're embedded in, and perhaps matters of order and duty that transcend the community, because of course these are, although you've stuck to the modern period, I noted down a quote that captures these themes. You'll recognise it, I'm sure, you and Mladen. Our country is a ship that bears us safe. Only when she prospers in our voyage, can we have full friendship together. Now this is of course Creon in Antigone, who is about to sentence Antigone to death for performing funerary rites over her brother Polycines. You see, we're completely out of modern time here. But what you've said to us this evening captures a whole human story here, that Antigone herself knows very well the law of Thebes, and she knows why the law of Thebes is there, and she knows her brother rebelled against the law of Thebes. He's one of the 7 tyrants. Yet she performs funerary rites out of, it's framed in different ways, isn't it? The duties of piety, her honouring her family, her duties towards her family, her duties towards the gods. Duties towards the gods, I mean, that is now our International Convention of Human Rights, isn't it? And our Human Rights Act. These duties that do not stem from the individual, but they stem from a broad public order, public state conception declared by, given by our modern version of a priest or seer, which is a legal authority, and tell us that these are an order that that are greater than our own rules that we can make in our own community. I wanted quickly to move from that to say that, you know, I think things are framed differently in the modern time because we move through Hobbes, don't we, to the social contract. Hobbes, who tells us at the end of the feudal period, with the collapse of identified face-to-face community with places in those communities, Hobbes sees the war of all against all, the rise of agricultural capitalism in England, the enclosures taking place in England, and wide-scale vagabonds, which of course we get through the French Revolution attempts to solve through a social contract. Well, the social contract is based upon the atomized individual, the community fractured. Well, of course, the community isn't fractured in one way, is it? Because it's technologically, the world is driven closely together around the needs of capital. And many of the institutions that you've been speaking of, these are large institutions that are ensuring public order, not just around human rights and so on, but also around trade, which is very important, around banking regulation and such like, are there to meet the need of big capital as well, which also transcends that of small communities. Small communities are not going to have a say that can interfere with international trade, for example. I mean, that's, as we know, one of the major platforms of the EU, which is what it stands for. And it seems to me, I'll finish off by saying that it seems to me that the only way I can see a solution through this is through the abolition of capital and some recapturing of the 12,000 frog communities around the pond of the Mediterranean that the Hellenic world saw. Unless we have got communities of a smaller scale, so that real participatory democracy can be meaningful, it's hard to see how we can progress.
Thanks, Richard. Jo?
I think Kerry asked, one of the first questions was about what was creating the move towards the sort of change away from what we had into a more sort of globalized order, and what were the different intermediary steps. And one of the things I've been trying to understand is you've spoken quite a lot about the mechanisms at the level, sort of the discussion from the point of view of power and how that's changed and internationalized the questions of law and our relationship therefore to it. But what we haven't really talked about is what is it that created citizenship in the first place, because it was never a one-sided discussion. It was a discussion that's been mediated over time from certainly in the last few hundred years, a process towards democratization. And so I suppose the discussion that I'd want to have in terms of citizenship is, without that pressure from below, where people see themselves as, and it comes back to Mladen's point, I suppose, about if international law is finding a new way to naturalize rights, but at a global level, we have a problem fundamentally, because there isn't any pressure that from below where people are counterposing any alternative, because, and as you can see from the discussion around COVID, is that and possibly even through the discussion about Shamina Begum, is at the most basic level, you do have the question about safety and security. And I'm wondering where that fits in. And I was thinking of, say, someone like Maslow and that hierarchy of needs, where it feels, and you can see this coming out through the last election, is the paternalism of protecting subjects was a very dominant discussion. So you might have internationalization on the one hand, but within a national context, you also have a discussion around basic needs and safety in a very paternalistic way that, unlike the English tradition of the past, the radical tradition that contrasted maybe with some aspects of the continent, where you have a very strong intellectual tradition within Britain, you don't have that at this moment in time. So the naturalization of order also seems to be happening at that sort of domestic level around those most basic needs, and there's no current at the moment that is there to challenge that, which you have had historically over centuries, where there's always been a counterweight that's challenging that way that the order's been presented. So in that context, it's very hard to conceive of how you could have any real discussion about citizenship today other than around basic safety and needs.
Thanks, Joe. Nicholas.
Yeah, hello. Can I just point out that Nikki's my wife? No, I'm Paul. Hey up. You're right.
Okay, sorry.
But that's all right. She's got, yeah. Nicholas, it's quite nice. Anyway, I just want to ask you a question here. I'm interested in the idea of citizenship and its relationship with border controls. When I was growing up in the 80s in left-wing politics, it seemed dead easy. You just said capital can move anywhere, so Labour should be able to move anywhere. And that was easy, and I could get on board with that. Now, I do understand things are more complex than this idea of citizenship. So I just really want to ask Vanessa and Mladen, is that can you question this whole, nebulous idea of global citizenship? Can you question that? Does that mean that you have to then support border controls or immigration controls? And I just want to, if I kind of want to know, is that Vanessa and Mladen, do you support immigration controls, particularly its relationship with citizenship? Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Alex again. Oh, sorry. Hold on. You okay? Alex?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on Vanessa's point. I liked her idea of the sandstorm politics, and I sort of want to get to, I guess, if we try and think about the protests going on at Hyde Park yesterday, and the in support of Floyd George in the US and the his killing and so forth. I mean, it is quite striking, isn't it, to see those people out there protesting, at least in the first instance, in support of something that's happening in the US. And so it has that quality of being placeless. That could kick off that debate, even though it perhaps changes over time and does become a lot more about the UK. So I guess my question is sort of what is it that people hope to accomplish out of that kind of protest? That it almost seems like it's a sort of performativity, and I think if we can answer that question, I think we can get to something about how particularly younger people are seeing citizenship today. Just sort of bringing another example and sort of causes of this, I think breaking down of boundaries, and obviously Frank Furedi's got a book coming out on importance of boundaries. But I think, and particularly the boundary between public and private has been really significant here. And I think young people who I've worked with, student teachers and so forth, they don't, they really don't identify with the nation state. I think if we took David Goodhart's polarization between somewheres and anywheres, when discussion around Brexit was going on, I mean, there were no young people I was working with who would support Brexit. They were all took the more cosmopolitan, transnational EU side of things. But I think and when it coming back to the curriculum again, another example of this is someone recently was she was wanting to instill feminism in her curriculum and build her curriculum around feminism, bringing feminists in to model for students and so forth. And I said to her, well, aren't you, isn't that politicizing your curriculum? And she said, well, feminism isn't political. And it just, but you can see how they're seeing they're seeing these things as they're not seeing boundaries. They're not seeing boundaries at all. They're just seeing I guess it's this sense of identity, sense of it's change within. And maybe so coming back to the protest in Hyde Park yesterday, is that kind of what it seems to be about, sort of a demonstration of identity and seeing that the citizenship means a change in the self, I guess, as opposed to something in society. So that's a question there.
Thanks, Alex. Ruth?
Yes, I wanted to make 2 points really about citizenship. One thing is how important is global citizenship really? Because you said it's mostly the young. So I wonder how many people are actually seeing themselves as global citizens. And also in terms of the global citizenship, is it global? Or does it mean that maybe it's multi-citizenship? And I'm thinking sort of if people like myself, I've been in Switzerland, now I live in England, so kind of I have a connection to 2 countries, but that doesn't make me a global citizen. So is it a multiple citizenship rather than a global one? Is there a difference somehow?
Thanks, Ruth. Nicholas?
Oh, hello. Right, as I've been listening to Vanessa and Mladen, what I've been thinking is how horribly sad, as well as how horribly true. I mean, it seems almost like the sort of really cynical perspective, and don't take this as an insult, please. The really sort of cynical perspective that you get coming through in a literary nasty by Michel Houellebecq, and I'm looking at a few of Michel Houellebecq's literary nasties on my shelf as I speak. So there we go. Just a couple of questions. First off, we've really been kicking against this idea of human rights. Human rights is the great beast, and clearly, I think it's probably fairly uncontroversial among us. The rhetoric of human rights, natural rights, has been turned into a kind of battering ram for the destruction of the nation state, which of course, ironically, is the only credible guarantor and defender of such rights. Does this mean that we have to bin off the concept of natural rights? You know, speaking as somebody who used to consider himself a kind of a liberal, you know, do we have to bin off John Locke? Do we have to bin off Tom Paine? Do we have to bin off the whole idea that human beings naturally have rights? Do we have to accept that the conservatism of Roger Scruton is the only way forward, that there is no alternative? Would be my first question. My second is about what we practically do about this, because it's obvious that everybody who ever manages to get elected to the British Parliament, as just one example, and one could say the same of every other legislature in the Western so-called democratic world, is entirely on board with the global program. So we've got a bit of a problem there. You know, Vanessa, Mladen, would you like to take this opportunity to endorse Nigel Farage? You know, it's basically, is that where we've got to go? Is it Farage or bust? And if not, is there any credible third way? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicholas. Sean, and then back to Mladen and Vanessa. Sean?
Yes. Well, I don't know if what I'm about to say, I don't know if it just repeats what people have already said in some way, but it's just like a sort of observation. I hope that the question emerges from it. But like it seems to me that the imperative behind, or you know, this kind of change is economic, as it always is, and you know, historically it's just part of a process. So if we say, you know, that it's always the economic elites who drive cultural change, so they create cultural conditions, or try to shape cultural conditions and encourage ideas and traits. So you know, you can look upon it as like a form of ideology, really, in that sense. So at one time, the ideology of the nation state, or the ideology of nationalism and supporting the nation state, of patriotism and all of that kind of thing, matched what the economic elites wanted. That's what was encouraged, the move from being a subject to being a citizen, and then the move to supporting an abstract entity, the state. So nationalism, and even in the context of colonialism and that kind of thing, you know, racism or whatever you like, you know. So, but that's kind of in the past. That's like the old model. But these kind of cultural things don't just spring in and out. Once they're created, they can't just be got rid of. So they kind of linger. But now the movement is onto something else. So the capital, the elites who move capital around, now do that internationally rather than just within the national establishment. So the new way of doing things comes from that level, really, I think. And so the ideas of transnationalism and the ideas of new forms of citizenship come from that kind of capital imperative, and that kind of competes with the old model. So you get some people who are still tied to the nation state, and some people who want to reject the nation state with a sort of transnational agenda. And so now citizenship is being shaped, this idea, it's shaped so as to support that international or that transnational way of doing things, to be able to move capital around. So it's encouraging people with attitudes and traits that, you know, believe in things like, you know, diversity or equality or gender equality and things like that. And that these are ideas of inclusion and diversity, are things that will allow global capital to move more freely, because, you know, you can't trade with people if you've got some kind of prejudice against them, or if you've got some adherence to kind of nationalism as opposed to internationalism. So it's that kind of thing. And I think that's why, I suppose leading up to it, why a lot of people on the left, oddly enough, ended up being Remainers, because I think they're attracted to a rejection of the old cultural model, without necessarily realizing that the new cultural model that they support, the EU and so on, really still comes from the capitalist elite. Anyway, it didn't end up being a question. It's more of an observation, really. So anyway, there we are.
Thanks, Sean. Vanessa and Mladen, Scruton and Farage supporters, what do you think?
I mean, we've just finished this. We've just finished the book, and now Mladen's moving on to his project, and I want to move on to my project. Is my starting point is Schiller's Ode to Joy. I've been reading a lot on Friedrich Schiller's work, and you know, his work is a sort of the anthem of the Europe, the Council of Europe, the EU. And if you look at Schiller's ideas, he's really concerned that we move from a sort of legalistic state where our behaviour is moral because we've got these laws that over us that tell us to be moral. And he wants to move to what he calls is the aesthetic state, where we are self-determining moral actors. And so a core concern that I have is that we've moved to a model of governance that denies us as moral, self-determining actors, and that we're being locked into what Schiller would have called a barbaric state, that we are beings who lack moral subjectivity, and therefore we need to be under a strict legal order, and that we need to be denied self-determination. So that's my sort of, and that's the direction that we are going in through a legalism, an anti-democrat, a development of the law that is away from demos, away from people. So that's my starting point. Is there that we're moving away from a democratic model of deciding that the laws, that we're no longer governed by the laws that we are authors of, that we're merely objects of law. And at the same time, while these expanding frameworks of rights are really attractive, actually, although natural law and so on, as Richard has indicated, comes from ideas of a sort of divine law, of providential order, of duties, actually human rights have become a degraded form of rights, that we're like consumers. We're consumers of rights. So I demand my rights, you demand your rights, he demands his rights, but there's no sense of that those rights are realised through each other as a community. They're no longer mutual rights. But what's happened through this sort of model where we're estranged from the law, that that we've also become estranged from each other, and that is in key respects polarizing society, and in that polarization it's fragmenting society, and so that we're becoming although our rights are multiplying, their meaning is becoming degraded, and that we're becoming more and more estranged from each other, with dangerous consequences for our freedom, equality, and security. Mladen? Yeah.
Okay. I'll try to respond to Paul's point about border controls, immigration controls, by just giving you an example of Bosnia. Bosnia, as you know, has been international protectorate for almost 30 years now, and very much a model for humanitarian or human rights inspired intervention. At the moment, Bosnia is on the migrant route, so-called Balkan route. People who travel through Bosnia, Paul's question was, am I in favor of border controls? Yes, I am. And I'll tell why. So these people come to the border from Serbia. They enter Bosnia. Bosnia authorities have constitution which Bosnia as a state has a constitution which says that human rights provisions supersede any domestic law, and all international conventions are part of Bosnian law and have priority over Bosnian law. So all those invoking international law who operate within Bosnia, like International Organization for Migration, they invoke provisions of international law to tell Bosnian authorities you should not interfere with these people's freedom of movement. So they can't be confined. Even when they commit a crime, they are not detained, or rather they are detained but quickly released upon finding out that they can't establish their identity. So even people who commit, who are suspected of committing a murder are released. But these people are subject to no law. Now the question is, you know, what have the locals got to do with it? Because these sorts of incidents happen usually amongst migrants themselves. Well, during this corona crisis in Bosnia, the authorities imposed a legal duty on the local citizens to wear a mask in public. And failure to do so resulted in a fine of about 200 pounds. In a country where average pension is about that much. At the same time, migrants who, in terms of disease, are equal to the locals, they're walking around without any mask or anything. And police are simply not bothering to talk to them and ask them why you're not wearing a mask. So I think the local people should have the right to decide who enters their country. And this is a fundamental question, which I think has got to do with the essential clash, I would argue, between property rights and human rights. I think human rights deep agenda, at least among those supporters who are on the left, is that human rights can be used to somehow torpedo, sabotage global capitalism and property rights more generally. But I'll stop there, and because I won't allow other people to come back if they want. Just briefly on Alex's point about what were protesters in Hyde Park trying to achieve, I would argue nothing, because it's not about collective action. The fact that there's lots of people at the same place, apparently gathered for the same reason, doesn't mean that they're going to achieve anything. And just also quickly, Ruth's question about multiple citizenship. Yes, I understand your question very much from my own experience, and I've all citizenships, one British and Croatian, but coincidentally, something Vanessa and I talked about today. You can't live in two places, can you? So you can have a two passports, but you can only live in one place at a time. That's my experience. So yes, multiple citizenship, but you only live in one place.
Thanks. Got lots of people. Hold on, Vanessa. Lots of people. Go on.
Yeah. Just quickly to say, in terms of this question of borders, you either have democratically determined borders, or you have borders determined by force. You're either a country that you have democratically determined borders, or those borders are determined by privately armed men, and you're a borderland. One or the other. Either it's determined by a political community, or it's determined by private actors. And what's happening in Bosnia? Bosnia is becoming a borderland where people are arming themselves to protect their property, because the country is not protecting itself and determining who is visiting and who is not visiting. Migration is fundamentally different from immigration. Immigration is you come into the country with the consent of the country and you become a citizen. It's a very different relationship, where it's one of a newcomer, a stranger becoming a citizen. The shift away towards human rights-based rights is a move away from the citizen becoming migratory labour.
Excellent point. Thank you. Mo? Mo?
Hi. Thank you. It's been really interesting so far. So I'm completely on board and understand the problems with a kind of international rights-based transnational sort of idea of citizenship, and why that's problematic in terms of kind of democratic accountability. Where I do have a problem with understanding what a citizen is in terms of the national context, in terms of the UK, for instance, is that if citizenship is determined by our relationship with the state and the rights and obligations we have to one another, and also the rights and obligations we have to each other, I think that's what it means anyway, that's what I have taken citizenship to mean, then for me that's I find it slightly problematic to argue this, because partly are we definitely a country that's united by a common language, history and culture. Certainly from having worked in the cultural sector, I know that people find it very hard to define what is a British culture, what that actually means. And if we are talking about our kind of obligations to one another, there are bits about globalization that I like, that I wouldn't want to lose, like international travel or the internet, for instance. And I've made friendships with people in other places, and I feel obligation to them. So as well as I do to my neighbour as well. So for me, I think it's sort of slightly echoing a little bit of what Joel was saying there. How can you argue for our obligation to our neighbour as opposed to our obligation for a friend in another country? And how do you argue for a nation-based concept of citizenship when the idea of the nation feels quite nebulous these days, and also the elite is so weak? It's kind of like, how strong is that obligation between the citizen and the state?
Thanks, Mo. Peter? Peter? Peter?
Hello?
Hello, Peter.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
I think it was Richard who mentioned Gaia earlier on. I think I've got that right. But that reminded me about a different perspective on the issue of rights. We talk about human rights, but with rights comes responsibilities. With wealth and power comes responsibilities. And I thought about this in terms of the natural environment. And it's interesting because it reminded me of the issue in America where the city of Toledo put forward a legislation to give Lake Erie ecosystem the rights of personhood. The bill's heart was a radical proposition that the Lake Erie ecosystem should be granted legal personhood and accorded the consequent rights in law, including the right to exist, to flourish, and naturally evolve. And this came about because of the degradation of the lake and the fact that because of the Anthropocene, if you like, perspective on how we treat the natural environment, it was all right to pump whatever you liked into the lake to the point whereby it became a dead zone. And the city of Toledo actually passed in law that it has become necessary, the bill declares, that we extend legal rights to our natural environment to ensure that the natural world no longer is subordinated to the accumulation of surplus wealth and unaccountable political power. And it just seems to me very interesting that we've talked at length about different aspects of human rights tonight, but we are part of a natural environment. If this pandemic had been like Ebola, it could well have been devastating for the human population. We could have ceased to exist and the earth wouldn't even have noticed. It would have carried on as if we had never existed. And it's important that if we grant ourselves human rights, we also have to extend those rights to the environment in which we live and exercise those rights responsibly.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to take 3 more people that have hands up, and then we're going to go back to Mladen and Vanessa for final comments, and then we'll continue informally. Sade.
Hi, good evening. Very interesting topic. And I'm not sure if I want to ask questions or just to make a comment, especially in the area of social construction of who is a citizen of a particular place. Sean has talked about the equality, inclusions, prejudice, and a lot of people from the minority group, which I come from, I represent, we find ourselves in a way that we're floating citizen. We're not, I don't see myself as a British because I have a British passport. And at the same time, I don't see myself as a Nigerian because I am from Nigerian origin, because I see that my being accepted to be a British citizen is not about my responsibilities towards my nation. It's about how people see me, how they perceive me. You know, when I talk, how do people react? Because, you know, you have a strong accent. Does my accent makes me not to be a citizen of a particular place or not? You know, I went to a training sometimes ago and we're just chatting and we're just talking. One of the ladies said, Shade, where are you from? Are you, you know, you have a very strong accent. And I asked the lady that, you have a very strong Scottish accent as well. Are you a Briton? Are you a British? And at the same time, you find yourself, you go to, I go to Africa or go to Nigeria, and they don't even accept you any longer because they see you that you've been westernized. You don't belong to us. You are not part of us any longer. So there's this kind of floating. So because of the social construction of who a citizen is, and the EU of this pandemic really want me to make feeling that where do I belong to? You know, the Nigerian government sent a plane that people from Nigeria should come home. And I discovered that one way or the other, they don't allow those who have British passports to be part of those that should come home. And at the same time, I have a sister that went to Nigeria. She has a British passport. She was arrested at the airport and she was there for 58 days. And British, when the case came to England, they said that she's no longer our citizen because she traveled to Nigeria with a Nigerian passport. And while she was in Nigeria, she was being treated as a British passport, a British citizen, and she was detained for 58 days. So sometimes the question is, who am I? Do I belong to Britain or do I belong to Nigeria? Because I don't see myself fully accepted as a British citizen. And at the same time, when I go to Nigeria, I don't see myself being accepted as a real Nigerian. So some of us, you know, it's like we're floating. You are not determined to be a citizen of the place because you have a passport and because you have responsibilities and you are doing everything that you're supposed to do. You pay your tax, but we still have a social construction around who a citizen is. That's a little comment I have to make.
Thanks, Shadi. Very useful. Richard. Richard? Richard?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Mladen, Vanessa, again, thank you very much for what you're talking about this evening. It's very good at making me think. And I must say, Vanessa, your mentioning Schiller made me realise that all that time I'd spent reading Schiller as an undergraduate, I hope it's not completely lost. I did feel my mind explode momentarily whilst you were talking a little about that. Just a couple of things that you said though, Vanessa, I just want to mention, just small points. Firstly, you said borders are either reached by agreement or by force. And I'll say, I had difficulty in thinking about where there was a border in Europe reached by agreement. The one border that springs to mind is the border that Michael Collins was assassinated for agreeing to on the island of Ireland, of course. Otherwise, the borders of France have more to do with Cardinal Richelieu and Italy with Garibaldi, Eastern Europe with the victors at Versailles, in fact, even the border between the United States and Canada has a lot to do with the burning down the White House, does it not? Really, by British troops rather than a negotiated settlement. So I think the lines drawn across the world, and I haven't even mentioned the Near East or the Middle East, are much more, it seems to me, the footprints of historical armies that we have to live our lives in the shadow of. And I wanted to say something briefly about the law, actually, because we've been talking about the law and the common law tradition, and I think it's just worth pointing out, really, that the common law in England became terribly legalized in the modern sense, really only in the Victorian era. There was a major reform between 1872 and 1875, as you'll realise, when the current High Court of Appeal and House of Lords were established. Before that, there were the traditional common law courts. And of course, in the common law courts, trial was by jury for everything. And in fact, most juries, as the only place, of course, where jury trial is properly preserved these days are in American jurisdictions, where quite often civil disputes, as you all know, motor accidents causing personal injury, these things are heard by juries, and the juries will do fact-finding. They will decide what happened, possibly in answer to interrogatories given to them by the judge. Did this happen? Yes or no? And the jury will say. And then in terms of penalty, well, that is, of course, the English common law tradition that doesn't exist here anymore. And really from the late Victorian period, if one looks at any textbook on contract or tort or so on, there are not many cases until the late Victorian era. And then with the jury system being supervened by the appeal courts that were set up at that time, it's the rise of the appellate courts, and of course give us the doctrine of precedent. When we didn't have any appeal courts, you didn't have judicial precedent, you just had jury decisions. Jury decisions keep the law in the hands of the local community. That's what it was. The citizens were deciding what the standards were, what the standard of the judge will tell the citizens what were recognised as crimes, but they would decide whether a crime had been committed. Indeed, in earlier days, of course, people accused of crime, I'm not suggesting we keep this, but they could actually partly deal with a matter by compurgation. You bring a jury, you bring 12 local people who knew you well, and they'd swear oaths as to your reputation. You know, in an era before forensic science, being able to prove your good standing within the community was itself seen as a form of reasonable proof. And the growth of law is something that it does seem to me that if one looks at histories of English law, the great growth in the late Victorian period is all to do with the difficulty in the common law system coming to terms actually with industrial production in Britain, and the kind of legislation that Parliament was bringing forward in order to facilitate advanced capital. And the common law system was really a system built for village agricultural communities. But something significant has been lost, really, which really could do with being regained. I think just very final point. Peter mentioned Lake Erie being a legal person. You and Mladen will know quite well, but of course it's in the in the Anglo-Saxon legal system. Of course, there are many people who are not natural persons, who are legal persons. Every company is a legal person and can have debts, can enter into contracts, can commit crimes, certain kinds of corporate crime. It can't be sent to jail, but its directors and so on could be punished for the crimes of the corporation. Charities, there are lots of things. Corporations sole. The status of Archbishop of York is a corporation independent of it having any particular office holder at a time. So Lake Erie being a legal person is something actually that is not unique at all in the Anglo-Saxon legal system.
Thanks, Richard. Vanessa and Mladen, I've muted you for some reason. Final thoughts before we go into an informal discussion? There's no point in saying be brief, no one ever is, but
I'll be brief.
Good.
I promise I'll be brief. I'll just go back to the question that we started with open discussion about the coexistence or conflict between national and cosmopolitan citizenship. Yes, I think there is a real conflict there and how it's worked out. It's there's we discussed at quite length, and just like to maybe refer to Charlie's comment about citizenship, and also what Ruth said about multiple citizenships, which is, I think, kind of makes the points sort of link. I think, Charlotte, you make a slight confusion between identity and citizenship. How you feel about being British and being Nigerian, I think it's a question of identity, it's a subjective question, whereas the question of citizenship matter. So I'll just end there. Thank you. Sorry for not responding to other points and questions, but
don't worry, Vanessa.
So I just wanted to finish with a bit of Arendt, who says nobody can be a citizen of the world as he is the citizen of his country. And just to finish on, I would argue that democratically persuaded communities are the safer places to be. It's global human rights protections are thinner guarantees than those secured through democratic persuasion. Developing global frameworks at a distance from societies does not involve the same democratically accountable relations, commitments and responsibilities for making policies work and living with, implementing and addressing the consequences of our collective decisions. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Vanessa. Fantastic discussion. I'm going to unmute everybody, I hope. But just before we do that, I'd just like to say we've got one new event. It's not strictly an East Midlands Salon, but on the 17th of June at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we've got a Midlands Higher Education Policy Network discussion about COVID-19 and higher education. We've got two speakers to kick off the debate. One is Petar Jandrik from the University of Zagreb, and the other is Dawn Foreman, Professor Dawn Foreman from Derby and several of Australian universities. So if you want to join that, it's entirely free, but it's a fascinating discussion. And so that's the other announcement, of course, is to remind everybody of the Battle of Ideas Festival at Buxton on the 3rd of October. We hope it will go ahead and all plans are in place, but I'm trying to unmute everybody now. So you can give it. Are you all unmuted? No. Oh dear.
Just do it yourself, Dennis.
Yeah.
Yeah, could do that. Yeah, all right. Clap, clap, clap. You're all unmuted now anyway.
Oh, well, thank you.
So I'm going to stop recording now. I hope. Sorry about this. Normally, it's going to participate.
There you go. I've muted myself actually.
Good.
I've unmuted myself.
Yeah, we can all. Vanessa, you're still muted.
Some people,
Vanessa, you need to unmute yourself.
some people have muted themselves. That's true.